The rain fell in a steady drizzle over Riverside City, the kind of gray morning that turned tempers short and patience thinner. Commuters huddled under umbrellas, muttering into phones, shuffling onto the bus with tired faces and damp coats. At the front of the line stood Claire Watson, clutching her designer purse and glaring at her watch as if it had personally offended her. The bus was late, again. And Claire, a marketing executive used to everything running on her schedule, was not the kind of woman who tolerated delays. When the bus finally pulled up, she stepped inside, heels clicking sharply against the metal floor. "About time," she snapped at the driver. "Do you even care how late people are because of you?" The driver, a tall black man in his early 50s with kind eyes and a calm face, looked at her in the mirror. His name tag read, D. Miller. "Morning, ma'am," he said evenly. "Sorry for the delay. Had a detour near the hospital." "I don't need excuses," she interrupted, swiping her transit card with exaggerated force. "Maybe if you people focused on doing your jobs instead of chatting at stops, this city would run better." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman in the front seat frowned. "No need to be rude, dear." But Claire ignored her, storming down the aisle to an empty seat. She opened her laptop, muttering under her breath, "Unbelievable. Late, wet, and surrounded by incompetence." The driver said nothing. He simply pulled back into traffic, guiding the bus through slick streets, windshield wipers keeping rhythm against the drizzle. He'd been driving this route for nearly 20 years. He'd seen people at their best and worst, and he'd learned that anger usually wasn't personal, just pain wearing a louder face. Still, her words lingered longer than he cared to admit. A few stops later, the bus jolted to a halt near the hospital entrance, the same one that had caused the delay. A nurse climbed aboard, smiling tiredly at the driver. "Morning, Mr. Miller." "Morning, Sarah," he replied warmly. "How's the little guy?" "Still waiting," she sighed. "No matching donor yet." Claire glanced up briefly from her laptop, her brow furrowing at the mention. The driver nodded with quiet understanding. "Keep praying," he said gently. "Sometimes, help shows up when you least expect it." Sarah smiled faintly. "I hope you're right." As she moved toward the back, Claire returned to her work, pretending not to hear. But something about that short exchange, the gentleness in his voice, the weight of the words, tugged faintly at her. No matching donor yet. She tried to shake it off. She had no time for sentimentality. That evening, the world came crashing down. Claire's son, Ethan, barely 10 years old, collapsed during soccer practice. By the time she reached the hospital, he was pale, barely conscious. The doctor's words hit her like a wave. "Your son's kidneys are failing. He needs a transplant as soon as possible." She blinked, disbelieving. "There must be a mistake. He's healthy. He's young." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the doctor said softly. "We'll put him on the donor list immediately, but time isn't on our side." Her legs nearly gave out. Days passed in a blur of white walls and sleepless nights. She sat beside her son's hospital bed, holding his small hand as machines beeped steadily. Family and friends visited, offered sympathy, brought flowers. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the clock and the agonizing wait for a miracle. One night, as she stared at the city lights outside the window, her phone buzzed. It was the hospital coordinator. "Mrs. Watson," the woman said gently, "we've found a match." Claire's heart leapt. "Oh my God. Who?" There was a pause. "The donor has requested anonymity until after the surgery. But he's already in pre-op. He came forward as soon as he saw your son's case." Claire pressed a hand to her chest, tears springing to her eyes. "Please tell him. Please tell him I'll never forget this." The surgery went smoothly. Ethan's color returned, his strength slowly building over the next few days. Claire spent every waking moment at his bedside, thanking every nurse, every doctor. But deep down, she couldn't stop wondering about the stranger, the person who had given her son a second chance. A week later, the doctor finally came in with a small smile. "Mrs. Watson, your donor asked to meet you." She stood immediately. "Yes, please. I need to thank him." He nodded toward the hallway. "He's right outside." Claire turned and froze. Standing there in a loose hospital gown, pale but smiling, was David Miller, the bus driver she had screamed at that morning in the rain. Their eyes met, hers wide with disbelief, his calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You, you're the donor?" He nodded softly. "Your son's name came through the list. I recognized it. Figured I could spare one kidney if it meant giving him a full life." She couldn't breathe. "But I was horrible to you." He smiled faintly. "Maybe you were just having a bad day. We all have those." Her eyes filled with tears as she stumbled forward, hands trembling. "You saved my child's life. After everything I said to you," he shook his head, "you don't owe me anything, ma'am. Just make sure he grows up kind. That'll be enough." Claire covered her mouth, sobbing silently. And for the first time in her life, the woman who once measured worth in status and power learned what real grace looked like. And it was sitting right there, smiling weakly in a hospital gown. The next morning, Claire brought flowers to the hospital, clutching them so tightly the paper crinkled in her hands. She wasn't sure what to say or how to act. She only knew she needed to see him. Her son Ethan was already awake, smiling for the first time in weeks, color returning to his cheeks. Every time she looked at him, her heart ached with gratitude and guilt. When she reached David Miller's room, she hesitated at the door. He was sitting upright in bed, reading an old paperback novel with his glasses halfway down his nose. The morning sunlight streamed in through the blinds, touching his face gently. He looked calm, not like a man who had just given away a part of himself, but like someone who had made peace long ago. She cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Miller?" He looked up, and when he saw her, a smile touched his lips. "Mrs. Watson, you didn't have to come all the way up here." "I did," she said, her voice trembling. "I owe you my son's life." "That's not something you just thank someone for in passing." He set the book aside and chuckled softly. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. I didn't do it for that." "But you didn't even know him," she said, her voice breaking. "Why would you do something like that for a stranger? Especially someone who—" She trailed off, ashamed. He watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "Because he reminded me of my own boy." Her head lifted slightly. "You have a son?" "I did," he said, his gaze drifting to the window. "His name was Jordan. He was 17 when he passed. Same eyes as your boy. Same laugh, too. He was a good kid. Wanted to be a mechanic. But when his kidneys failed, there was no donor in time." Claire's heart sank. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." He shook his head gently. "That's life, Mrs. Watson. Sometimes we lose. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we get a chance to turn someone else's loss into hope." She sank into the chair beside his bed, speechless. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint beep of the heart monitor and the hum of the rain outside. Finally, she whispered, "You saved my child because you couldn't save yours." David smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe because I didn't want another mother to go through what I did." Her throat tightened as tears blurred her vision. "I don't deserve your kindness." He looked at her with quiet warmth. "Kindness isn't about deserving. It's about doing what's right." Over the next few days, Claire visited him often. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they just sat in silence, the unspoken bond between them growing deeper. She learned that he had driven city buses for over 25 years, never missing a shift, even through storms and holidays. His late wife, Marcia, had been a nurse. They'd both believed in helping others, even when they had little to give. When she asked why he never mentioned his son before, he said simply, "People don't ask bus drivers about their lives. They just want to get where they're going." The words stung. She remembered her own impatience that day, her rudeness, her arrogance, her blind belief that kindness was something reserved for people on her level. One afternoon, she brought Ethan to meet him. The boy shuffled shyly into the room, clutching a small drawing. "Mr. Miller?" he said in a soft voice. David smiled. "Hey, buddy. You must be the one keeping everyone on their toes." Ethan grinned. "Mom says you gave me your kidney. That means I have part of you now." David laughed warmly. "Guess that makes us family, doesn't it?" He took the drawing from Ethan's hands, a colorful picture of a bus with two smiling faces in the front window. "That's me and you," Ethan explained proudly. You're the one driving. David's smile faltered for just a moment, and he blinked back tears. That's a fine bus, son. You're a good artist. When visiting hours ended, Claire lingered by the door. Mr. Miller, she said softly, I want to do something for you. Anything. You changed my life. Let me repay that somehow. He shook his head. You already did. You said thank you. That's enough. She shook her head. No, it's not. You deserve more. He smiled. What I deserve doesn't matter much. What matters is that your boy gets to grow up. You just make sure he lives a life worth the gift. That's how you pay me back. As she left the room, Claire realized something profound. David didn't just save Ethan's life. He was saving hers too. Not her body, but her heart. The angry, impatient woman who once yelled at a stranger for being 5 minutes late was slowly disappearing. And in her place, someone better was beginning to take shape, stitched together by humility, gratitude, and the grace of a man who'd lost everything but still chose to give. When David Miller was finally cleared to leave the hospital, the nurses threw him a small farewell celebration. Nothing fancy, just paper cups, store-bought cupcakes, and a chorus of goodbyes from the staff who had grown fond of him. His calm spirit and gentle humor had turned his recovery room into a sanctuary of kindness. Claire arrived late that morning with Ethan, holding a basket of homemade muffins. She wasn't the same woman who had once snapped at him on the bus. The stiffness in her voice was gone, replaced by something soft, real. Even her clothes were simpler. No designer logos, no air of superiority, just sincerity. You didn't have to bring anything, David said, smiling as she set the basket on his table. I wanted to, she said. Though, fair warning, I'm a terrible cook. Ethan grinned. I helped, David chuckled. Then I'm sure they'll taste great. As he reached for his coat, Claire noticed the way he hesitated, one hand pressed to his side. You shouldn't be up and about so soon, she said, concerned. I'm fine, he assured her. Just taking it slow. Doctor says I'm strong enough to get back to work in a couple of weeks. Work? She asked, frowning. You mean driving the bus again? He nodded. It's what I do. She blinked, stunned. You just gave away your kidney, and you're planning to go back to 12-hour shifts? David smiled faintly. Bills don't pay themselves, Mrs. Watson. And those folks need rides. Her heart sank. The thought of him back on that bus, worn out, overlooked, giving his all for a city that barely noticed him, felt wrong. Mr. Miller, she began, then stopped. He turned to her patiently. David, he corrected gently. You can call me David. She smiled slightly. Then you have to call me Claire. Fair enough, he said. She took a breath. David, what if you didn't have to go back? What if you let me help you? Not as repayment, but because you deserve something better. He raised an eyebrow. Better? Yes, she said earnestly. You have more wisdom and heart than anyone I've ever met. I run a marketing firm. We do community outreach projects, mentorship programs, partnerships with local heroes. People like you deserve to be seen. I could help you tell your story, inspire others. He laughed quietly. You want to make me a celebrity? No, she said quickly. I want to make sure people learn from you. You gave my son life. The least I can do is make sure your kindness lives beyond this hospital. He studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Claire, he said softly, I'm not the hero you think I am. I'm just a man who made a choice. Exactly, she said. And that's what the world needs to see. That heroism doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it drives a bus in the rain. David smiled, shaking his head, but there was warmth in his eyes. You're persistent. I'll give you that, she grinned. You saved my son. Persistence is the least I owe you. Over the following weeks, they stayed in touch. At first, it was just updates about Ethan's recovery. Then it became coffee meetings, shared lunches, long talks about life, loss, and what really mattered. David told her stories from his years on the bus, the people he'd met, the strangers he'd helped without anyone noticing. Claire listened like a student, realizing how narrow her world had once been. One day, she asked if she could ride his route with him, just to see what it's like. He laughed, but agreed. That next morning, she boarded his bus just as the sun rose. No longer the angry woman in heels, but a quiet passenger with a grateful smile. She watched him greet every rider with kindness, from the exhausted nurse to the homeless man counting coins. There was no judgment, no rush, just humanity. At one stop, a young mother dropped her groceries, and David immediately stood to help her gather them. Claire saw how naturally he did it, how genuine his care was, and for the first time she understood. This wasn't a job to him. It was his way of serving the world. As they reached the final stop, she turned to him and said, "You don't just drive people, David. You carry them. Every day." He smiled, eyes crinkling. "Maybe. But I think today you carried me a little too." That evening, Claire called her team and told them she wanted to launch a new initiative, a storytelling campaign about unsung heroes. When they asked what inspired it, she smiled and said, "A man who taught me that grace rides the bus." She didn't tell David right away. She wanted it to be a surprise. But deep down, she knew. Their stories were now bound forever. His quiet generosity, her transformation, and a little boy's second chance. None of them had planned this journey. But somehow, life had put them all on the same route. And this time, Claire wasn't yelling at the driver. She was thanking him every mile of the way. The story broke almost by accident. A local news reporter had heard about a city bus driver who donated a kidney to one of his passengers' children. A story so unbelievable it sounded like a movie plot. When the segment aired on the evening news, it lasted barely 3 minutes, but by morning it had spread everywhere. The driver who gave life twice. A stranger's sacrifice. Grace on Route 47. Within days, reporters camped outside David's small apartment building, cameras flashing as he left for his early shift. But David, as always, handled it with quiet grace. "I just did what anyone would have done," he told them, smiling politely. "Please focus on the boy who's doing better now. That's the real story." Meanwhile, Claire was watching the coverage from her office, a knot forming in her chest. She knew how much he hated attention, yet the world couldn't get enough of him. Every major outlet wanted an interview. Every brand wanted to feature him in some campaign. And every time he declined, the media painted him as even more saintly. She picked up her phone and called him. "David, it's Claire. Are you all right?" He chuckled softly. "You'd think I won the lottery the way folks are acting. I'm fine, Claire. Just trying to get to work without tripping over microphones." She smiled, relieved by his calm. "You shouldn't have to go through this. I wanted to make sure you were okay with all this attention." "I don't mind," he said simply. "If it makes people think twice about helping each other, it's worth the noise." She hesitated. "You really don't want to do any interviews?" He laughed lightly. "I already said everything that matters. Be kind. Don't think I can top that." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that his story could do more than inspire. It could change things. That weekend, she sat at her kitchen table with Ethan, flipping through his hospital scrapbook. On the final page was the drawing he'd made for David, the bus with their faces in the window. She traced it with her finger and whispered, "We have to do something for him." Ethan nodded eagerly. "We could help kids like me, the ones waiting for new kidneys." And that's how the Jordan Miller Foundation was born, named after David's late son. Claire poured her time, resources, and connections into it, reaching out to hospitals, donors, and medical charities. The mission was simple: provide support to families of children awaiting organ transplants. Not just medical aid, but emotional and financial help too. When she told David about it a week later, he was speechless. "You named it after my boy?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, smiling through tears. "He didn't get his second chance. But now, because of you, other children will." For the first time since she'd met him, David's composure faltered. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "He'd have liked that. He had a big heart, that kid. Always said he wanted to help people when he grew up." "Well," Claire said softly, "he's doing that now. Through you." The foundation's launch was held at the community center downtown. Reporters came, of course, but this time David couldn't hide. He stood at the podium beside Claire, looking out at the crowd of families, doctors, and former patients. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "I don't know much about speeches," he began, his deep voice carrying warmth. "But I know about love. I lost my son once. I thought that was the end of my story. But God had other plans. He gave me a second chance to be a father, not by blood, but by heart. And that little boy sitting there." He looked at Ethan, who waved from the front row, grinning proudly. He reminded me that life keeps giving us reasons to hope. The room was silent, every face turned toward him. So, if you ever wonder whether what you do matters, David continued, just remember, kindness doesn't disappear. It finds its way back to you even when you least expect it. The applause was thunderous. Claire stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she wasn't crying from guilt or pain, but from awe. After the event, as the crowd dispersed and the photographers packed up, David and Claire stepped outside. The evening sky was painted with soft gold and lavender, the air cool and calm after a long day. Claire looked at him and said, "You know, the world's calling you a hero." He smiled gently. "Heroes are just people who do what needs doing when no one else will. Besides," he added, glancing at her, "you did your share too. You turned loss into legacy." She shook her head. "No, David, you showed me what it means to see people. I just followed your lead." They walked in silence for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I used to think life was about climbing ladders. Now I think it's about building bridges." He chuckled. "Well, lucky for me, I drive one every day." She laughed, the sound soft and grateful. And as they parted ways that night, one returning to his modest apartment, the other to her quiet home, they both carried the same peace in their hearts, the kind that only comes when grace and goodness find each other halfway. Neither of them knew it yet, but the Jordan Miller Foundation would go on to save dozens of children, each one a living continuation of the kindness that began on a rainy bus route. A story born in anger had become one of love, and that, perhaps, was the truest miracle of all.